All right, everybody, it's Dr. Parker. I'm going to dive into your Canterbury Tales questions, which are very good. I enjoyed just reading the questions. I hope I have a couple of answers, although I can't guarantee anything. We're going to start with Sarah's. The first question, you spoke about the order of the tales. Do you think Chaucer wrote them in a specific order for a specific reason, and who has the correct order? Uh, that's a much debated question, needless to say. The way we talk about the ordering of the tales is we talk about them in fragments because there are places where there are clear transitions from tale to tale. For example, at the end of the knight's tale, the host congratulates the knight on his tale, asks the monk to tell a tale, but the miller interrupts and says that he will tell his tale and nobody can stop him. So we know, for example, that the knight's tale is followed by the miller's tale. And so we've got a series of fragments. They are fairly widely agreed upon as to what order they come in, but when there are differences in opinion about the order, it usually is thematic. In other words, is Chaucer trying to present a group of tales about marriage here, or is he trying to alternate moral and immoral tales, or something like that? So, the short answer is we don't really know. I think we have a pretty good idea about some of the ordering. I don't know who I think has the correct order. This book you're using, and somebody asked this question a little bit later on, uses the Ellesmere ordering, and that is for the most part pretty widely accepted. Some people do the Ellesmere ordering with the Bradshaw shift, which is just a shift of one of the fragments. But most people talk about the Ellesmere. The Ellesmere is a beautiful manuscript. It's in San Marino, California. There's the Huntington Library in San Marino, which is attached to the Huntington Foundation, has got the Ellesmere manuscript. They've got a Gutenberg Bible. They have an early, it's not a first folio of Shakespeare, but it's an early folio of Shakespeare. They've got all kinds of amazing, wonderful things to see. But anyway, so the one thing that people talk about with the ordering of the Canterbury Tales is that it's pretty clear that the Knight's Tale is the first. And the Knight's Tale is very noble, but it ultimately ends pretty bleakly, and it is notable too that it is a pagan tale, that the characters pray to Roman gods. And the last tale in the Canterbury Tales is the Parson's Tale, which is taken, which is a sermon, and it's taken to be sort of a very, very holy and morally correct kind of thing. Now nobody reads that one anymore because it's just awful. It's excruciatingly boring. But one of the things that's been proposed about Chaucer's ordering is that he's trying to present you with a bunch of different worldviews, beginning with the knights, which represent sort of nobility without Christianity, which is ultimately fruitless. And then he ends with the Parson's Tale, which of course is Christianity informing morality, and that is the one that he seems to settle on, and it seems like that's where he wants you to land up. So I think that that's a reasonable way to look at it. I don't think we've got extremely compelling evidence that that's true, but it makes a lot of sense. Number two, I've heard a couple of tales fall under the category of fablio. Could you explain this? Yes, we'll talk about fablio a lot when we come to the Miller's Tale and the Reeves Tale and things like that. Fablio is a French genre. There's something like 150 plus fablio surviving in French. There are really only a few in English. They're Chaucer's. There's one called Dom Cyrith. There are really not many in English, but it was basically a short, dirty story. It usually involves sex. It usually involves some kind of bodily function, some kind of bathroom humor. The Miller's Tale, as it goes, is actually pretty tame. The fablio that I'm thinking of in French, I'm embarrassed I'm not even going to tell you the titles of them because the titles are so absolutely foul that I don't want to record myself saying them. So were these sorts of tales popular at the time? Yes, and it's one of those areas where even though there's not much textual survival, they seem pretty clearly to be the kind of story that would be passed on orally. I mean, they're essentially dirty jokes. So they seem to have been popular. There's been a lot of debate about at first these were always considered to be lower class tales, that these must be the stories that the lower classes like to tell. But more recent scholarship has suggested that they're more of an upper class amusement, even though they are put in the mouths of lower class characters in a lot of cases that nobody was really, reading except for the upper classes at this point. So, yes, they were popular then, just as they're popular now, and just then as now, they're written down a lot less often than they're passed on orally. I think that's safe to say. Number three, do you think Chaucer was influenced by Boccaccio's Decameron? Yes. In fact, some of the tales are reworkings of Boccaccio's story. For example, the Reeve's Tale. The Knight's Tale is taken from Boccaccio's Teseida, which is not part of the Decameron. But yeah, the whole idea of the frame story in Decameron, you've got young people who are fleeing the plague. So they leave the city to go to the country, actually, which was pretty smart. And they tell between them 100 stories, these sort of attractive, wealthy young people. So Chaucer is certainly taking some of that as an influence. Also, Marguerite de Navarre wrote a collection called the Heptameron, which was very much influenced by Boccaccio, which was probably something that Chaucer had seen. So yeah, this vogue for sort of a collection of stories within a frame is pretty much a popular one. Not surprisingly, it's a good one. All right, so we're moving on to Callie's questions. Why has the Ellesmere manuscript been considered the best ordering of the tales? Does it differ from the order given in our book? So, right, no, your book does use the Ellesmere order. The Ellesmere manuscript is very appealing for a lot of reasons. It's the one that it follows this thing that I was talking about a little bit ago about beginning with the Knight's Tale and ending with the Parson's Tale. It is also it's a none of the manuscripts are any closer to Chaucer's life than 50 years, but it's probably the closest one. It probably is just about 1450 or so, about 50 years after Chaucer dies. It's also very, very elaborate and beautiful illuminated manuscript with pictures from the work. So it seemed that there's sort of a feeling that somebody went to a lot of trouble and expense to produce this. So it seems like they might have gone to the most trouble to make it true to Chaucer's form. So everything about the manuscript and its ordering is just attractive. Now that certainly doesn't make it authoritative. It doesn't mean that it's the only order there could be. And you can find articles where people will make an argument for a different ordering. And then you also run into the idea that if this were in fact an unfinished work, which it seems to be, maybe Chaucer had not yet decided on his order. Maybe he's going to flip things around or write some more and insert them in between other ones. We don't know. So more or less all we have to go on are thematic elements and then the links between the tales that form the fragments. Do I think Chaucer intended to write more tales? Maybe. I certainly don't think he intended to write 120, which is what he would have to do to have each pilgrim tell 2 stories there and 2 stories back. I can't imagine that was his plan, and if it was a little bit too ambitious. I don't know. I mean, we know that we're pretty sure that some of these stories were already sitting around in Chaucer's desk drawer. The Knight's Tale, for example, seems to have been mentioned before it appeared in the Canterbury Tales. So in some ways, it might have been a catch-all to pick up some of Chaucer's works that he had already completed, but then some things we think probably were composed afterwards. So does he intend to write more? I can't think of an area where I feel as though there's a big gap. I can't think of, for example, a character who stood out just amazingly in the general prologue who needs a tale. I can't think of a moral or religious theme that needs to be addressed that hasn't in some form or fashion been addressed. So I don't know. That's, like I said, we can't ever know. I wouldn't be surprised if he had lived another 20 years if 1 or 2 more made them in there. It's such an open-ended format that it's hard to say. He might even declare them ended and then 5 years later reopen them and stuck some in there. So it's an intriguing thing to think about what the other tales might have been. You also have things like the Cook's Tale, which appears to be unfinished, but there's a big argument to be made that, again, sort of like the House of Fame, that it's intentionally unfinished. And we'll talk about that, I think, when we get to it. And then number 3, what role does the prologue have to preface each tale? And it depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about the general prologue, the GP, as a prologue to the entire group of tales, and that's one thing. But some of the individual tales have prologues as well, although not all of them, but some of them do. So the general prologue, I think, we'll talk about that in a lot of detail next week, but it is, it's an estate satire. It's giving us a lot of talk about class. It's giving us talk about the characters. And in many cases, probably most cases, you can match the teller to the tale. There's something about the teller's personality that dictates the tale that he or she tells. Although you can make an argument in a few cases that they don't seem to match up. I can't remember which tale it is, but there's one where the pronouns haven't all been switched. They needed to be switched from masculine to feminine, and only some of them were, which suggests that Chaucer had a story and then he reshaped it to put it in the mouth of a female character. But anyway, so the general prologue gives us an idea of all the characters. The prologues to each tale, it depends on the tale. For example, in the Pardoner's Tale, the prologue is really, really important. And it sort of illuminates what he does in the tale, which is to tell a sermon with which he intends to swindle people out of their money. The Wife of Bath's prologue is a good bit longer than her tale, because it's about her, and what she really prefers to talk about is her. But it also serves as a weird parallel to her tale, which is a fairy tale, that her own life in some ways is a very sort of messed up and perverse version of the fairy tale that she tells. So I think each prologue can serve a slightly different purpose. But the general prologue, I think, is more to tell us about their society and give us an introduction to each character that only gets illuminated further on. So good question. We'll skip over now to Julie and her questions. Each tale, this is a good question, each tale appears to be named according to the teller's occupation. Is the occupation of each teller significant to the tale that he or she tells? And the first thing I want to point out is right, you're very right to notice that the way characters are referenced in the Canterbury Tales is by profession. So you have the knight, you have the miller. But I want you to keep that in mind, because we also have a character who is called the Wife of Bath. And her profession ostensibly is that she's a weaver. She makes very fine cloth. But I think that there's a lot of wisdom in the naming, because really the way she's made her money is by being married and widowed repeatedly over and over again. And she keeps inheriting. So I think that there is, in fact, a significance to the fact that she's not called the weaver, but she's called the wife. I think that this is very much a big concern of Chaucer's in the general prologue. He's very interested in profession and how it relates to class and how it might relate to what kind of person you are. Is it significance to the tale that each one tells? Yes, sometimes, the knight tells a story about knights because he understands the code of chivalry and things like that. On the other hand, the Franklin's Tale, the Franklin, who is a kind of landowner person, tells a love story of a young couple. Like, actually, the husband is a knight. So really, his profession per se doesn't really influence his tale. So I think it depends. I mean, I think if Chaucer feels as though someone has to have special knowledge to tell a tale, then he might relate that to the profession, but not in every case. I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis. Number 2, given any other situation, would they speak to each other? That's a good question, because I don't know what the kind of custom, if I pass you in the street, is in the 14th century. I would think these would all be people who could make eye contact with each other. Nobody is so far above or below anybody else. Now, the second part of your question, you say, did anyone's occupation put him above or below anybody's station? And not really, except the knight is a knight. He is Sir somebody. So technically, he is a member of the aristocracy, although I don't think he's a wealthy landowner. I mean, I think he's more of a knight than anything else. That's his first profession. But he is technically above other people in station. And then you also have things like the prioress is, at least at work, she's above the nun who travels with her. But that does not mean necessarily socially that they were out of line with each other. So, no, one of the things about the general prologue is that these characters are all pretty much middle class. So you've now got this class, and I think Chaucer's interested in having things like the miller be very brazen to the knight, for example, where I think the social norms are being tested and pushed at this point in history. So I think it's kind of unclear if anybody's above or below anybody else. And of course, Chaucer also makes kind of some of the lowest class people on there. The plowman, particularly, who's a manual laborer, he's probably the lowest class of all of them, is one of the best characters morally and in terms of his spirituality. So Chaucer is interested in messing with these ideas of class and occupation and social station, as you put it. But back to your first question, would they have spoken to each other? I don't know. I mean, I think some kind of greeting probably would be in order, but I cannot tell you exactly what that might be. I don't think people just walked around silently, though. It's a world where I mean, maybe not so much so in the city, but it's a world where you could go for 6 hour stretches and not see another person. It's a lightly populated world. The way that we're used to dealing with crowds that would stun them. I mean, if they walked into a concert or even a high school graduation, they would never have seen so many people gathered together at one time, unless they had lived in London and seen a big procession or something like that. So I'm not sure what the social norms are, but I suspect that if you do get to the point in your day where you see somebody, you probably say something. It just seems rude not to. Number 3 in the historical F.R.H. Du Boulez, the historical Chaucer, very, very nice. Did Chaucer identify and reference actual people? Yeah, probably so. The Manly essay is a pretty old one, but it doesn't make it bad. It's a foundational essay about Chaucer. Yeah, in some cases it's been fairly well proven. Harry Bailey, who is the host, is identified with somebody. The prioress probably is identified with somebody. Even the pardoner, there's been a lot of argument, but there's some talk that the pardoner has been identified with a specific character. Yeah, so I think so. Now, I also think you have to be careful about how far you want to take it, because he could use someone as a jumping off point. I want to write about a jolly innkeeper. And if you happen to know a jolly innkeeper, you might start with that as kind of a base, but that doesn't mean then that it was a slavish portrait or imitation. So I don't know. And then you've asked, who do I identify with each character? I don't know those off the top of my head. You can look them up, but I think except for the host, I think all of the identifications are tentative. There's sort of maybe more than one candidate. The host was actually, I mean, the Tabard was a real place. The place where they gather, that's a real place. You can go to London now, go to Southwark, and it's parking lot, unfortunately, but you can see where the Tabard would have been, and the host is based on the real innkeeper at the Tabard. So that's about as realistic as it gets. Other than that, probably there were some inspirations who served as jumping off points, but we have so little biographical information about people from the Middle Ages that it's hard to find records and things like that. Unlike us, where they're going to have much more information than they would ever hope or want to have for any reason. Okay, Susanna's questions. So this is the reception question. How did the audience view the tales? Who knows? I mean, it's they were read, they were mentioned, but again, it's not a society that records its every move and thought and reaction. So it's very hard for us to know. Now, when Chaucer has got crass stories, some of the kind of blue humor type stories, the Miller's Tale, for example, in the prologue to the Miller's Tale, he's very careful to sort of say, in a very tongue-in-cheek way, he says, Don't blame me. You said, ladies and gentlemen, if you read something that makes you unhappy, don't blame me. You know what kind of guy the Miller was, and so what kind of story would you expect from somebody like that? In exactly the same way that the Miller, a few lines earlier, says, if I say something that sounds rude or crass, don't blame me, blame the beer, because the Miller, even though it's 8 or 9 in the morning, is already so drunk he can barely sit on his horse. But I think this is a really tongue-in-cheek move on Chaucer's part because there is no Miller, there is no beer. I mean, this is all. If Chaucer's telling you a crass story, it's because he wants to tell you a crass story. So he has this little sort of jokey way of putting off the blame. But he also writes in that same prologue that this is going to be a dirty story. If you don't like this kind of thing, turn the page and choose another tale. He says, I have plenty of things in here that are historical, that are moral, that are religious, that are chivalric. And so if you'd like to read another kind of story, nobody's making you read this one. Why don't you switch over and read something else? So he anticipated some kind of negative reaction, but he also attempts to forestall it by sort of warning people ahead of time, this is what you're in for. If you don't like it, go read one of my more uplifting stories, I guess. Would housewives hide them? I like this. So this is the 50 Shades of Canterbury theory that housewives are reading this under the table. I don't know. I don't think many people would have a copy. For one thing, I think that this is this is going to be the kind of thing that is read out loud. There are going to be relatively few copies of it passed around, and as witness to that, like I said, we don't really have copies surviving from Chaucer's lifetime. Would parents snatch them from the hands of teenagers? I don't know. That's a good question. Now, are they considered to be mocking a religious practice? And we'll get into this a lot, and this also goes to your next question. Because certainly Chaucer is mocking a lot of religious, in other words, religious folks. Certainly the monk and the friar and the summoner and the pardoner and probably the prioress to some extent are being lampooned. And this is the place where Chaucer was practicing satire. I mean, he's certainly poking fun with an aim to improve. The satire is meant to not only be funny, but it's meant to cajole the audience into seeking some kind of change. So Chaucer, and I think we may have mentioned this, and we will certainly mention it some more. Chaucer was not necessarily himself a lollard, Lollard, but he had associates who were, and these were people who were objecting to some of the Catholic Church's practices, such as the selling of indulgences and things like that. However, Chaucer also is careful to make a good, several good characters of religion, specifically the parson, who is perhaps the best person in the tales, who is affiliated with the church. So I think Chaucer is being very careful to show you that he's not mocking or rejecting the faith. Rather, he is mocking and rejecting some of the corrupt practices of some of the people affiliated with the church. So there, I think is what I would say about that. So your next question, if the church didn't care for these tales, who was doing the copying? Yeah, this is a good question because I think you're working under the assumption that monks were doing most of the writing. And that would have been true even 100 years earlier, or 150 years earlier. But we have now, by the time we get to Chaucer, we've moved into the age of the professional scribe. And in fact, there's actually a fairly funny poem by Chaucer called Adam Scrivener, a scrivener being a scribe, where he sort of is talking in the voice of his scribe and kind of making fun of him because apparently Adam was a fairly sloppy and lazy scrivener. So this is not probably being copied in a monastic scriptorium. I think you're right about that. I think we're in an age where it's pretty well documented that we have professional scribes writing these things out. Now, I do think Chaucer probably wrote his first copy himself. And as I say, we don't know of copies that existed during Chaucer's lifetime, but I assume that there were some. And they probably, and as I say, Chaucer himself addresses his scribe in some cases. So that's what that would be. And again, did Chaucer do read alouds? I'm guessing he did, whether he did it or somebody else did, but I'm guessing that he would do it. Um, where would it be? I'm guessing more in the palace than in the public square, but I couldn't even promise you that. Among his friends, royal entertainment, I think, is not a bad guess, and he would probably be picky about what he read and didn't. If it were a gathering of church officials, he might not read the Miller's Tale or something to that effect. Um, and you said the type of humor in these works was not what was normally valued by the religious scholars of this time. Um, I don't know that. I don't know that to necessarily be true. I think that we have a stereotype. We have a feeling of clergy as being kind of abstemious and not laughing at dirty jokes and things like that. And I'm not so sure that life wasn't a little more thoroughly integrated back then, where a clergyman might be comfortable laughing at some of these things. I don't know that for a fact, but I think that religion was such a pervasive uh, water that everyone was swimming in all the time that I think where we can tend to be inclined to separate, our Sunday selves from our Saturday night selves. I don't necessarily think that the separation was as complete back then. So I'm not sure that there is a mismatch with the humor. Maybe in some cases, but maybe less so than you might expect. I don't know. I know. I certainly know I've known some Catholic, some priests and Jesuits with pretty hearty senses of humor that I wouldn't be afraid to tell a joke to. So I don't know. It's a good question, and so many of these things are just things that we can't know, but they're fun to speculate about. And then finally, Becca, who wants me to answer more than three questions, she wants, I think, five questions. Yes, five questions. So overachieving. Uh, Thank you for that. So the first question, the fraternity of cloth artisans, the weaver, the dyer, the tapster. One of them being called My Lady. Yeah, that's the wife of Bath. She is a weaver. There were a few professions that a woman might have in that, and sure, we'll talk about widowhood when we talk about the wife of Bath. But certainly, being a widow was one of the few ways that you had the opportunity to have a career or to have some kind of control over your life. But weaving, beer making in London, most of the best beer makers were women, which seems kind of odd. There's a fantastic poem by John Skelton from the early 1500s called "The Tunning of Eleanor Rumming," about this ugly, very unhygienic old lady and making her beer. And it's disgusting and it's hilarious. And if you get a chance, you ought to read it. So yeah, but in this case, the lady actually is a lady. This isn't sort of an effeminacy kind of joke. The shipman, did he steal wine? Oh yeah. There are a lot of. It's interesting because this is a pilgrimage, so we're thinking, oh, these are religiously minded people. But honestly, a lot of them are probably just it's a vacation. They're just trying to get out of town. There's no guarantee that anybody on this pilgrimage is particularly holy. So yeah, they're doing all kinds of carrying on, drinking and stealing, and there's some not particularly savory characters on this thing. Um, the double negative. Yeah, this is a really good question because this goes to Middle English grammar. In Middle English, you put as many negatives as you can stand into it. And the more you put, the more negative it becomes. This whole idea of two negatives make a positive is sort of an 18th century invention of grammarians who, they essentially what they were doing is they were trying to apply rules of mathematical logic and also of Latin grammar to English grammar. So whereas Chaucer could say, I'm not ever, or what would he say? I ain't never going not back there, no how, no way. That would just mean I am never ever going back there. We get this sort of 18th century logic, and we say that if we multiply a negative times a negative number, we get a positive number, and we apply it to grammar and say two negatives make a positive. So if you say, I ain't got no strawberries, it means I have got strawberries, which is ridiculous. But there you go. So to go to your question, double negatives do not cancel each other out. They just add negativity, and the more you pile on, the better. Number four, so the partner, we'll talk about him in some detail, and there tons of ink has been spilled about this. Is the partner gay? And we'll talk about it some. I mean, the whole categories of gay and straight and bisexual and things like that are very tricky to talk about in a medieval context because they didn't do gender identities in the way that we do. There were certainly homosexual acts and heterosexual acts, but there wasn't necessarily an identification of someone who does one or the other as being defined by that. Now, having said that, the partner is right. The narrator says, I think he was a gelding or a mare. And a gelding is, of course, a castrated horse, and a mare is a female horse. So there's and he's got a lot of effeminate characteristics about him. He's often assumed to be paired with a summoner who's his friend, it says, and they sing together and things like that. Yeah, a lot has been written about this, and a lot of people take a very psychological approach to it and say that the reason that the partner is so self-loathing and so kind of evil is that he has been rejected so firmly by society because he's gay. But more recently, Lee Patterson, this has probably been 10 or 12 years ago, wrote an article, I think it's called Chaucer's Partner on the Couch Again, talking about psychoanalysis and the danger of psychoanalyzing medieval literary characters because they're not real people, number one. And number two, the medievals didn't really think about psychology necessarily in the same way we do. And what Patterson says, Lee Patterson, who died recently, he taught at Duke for years and years, what he said is that he sees the partner as being a representative of a sick church, and that he is kind of impotent. He's lost the authority of the church because he's involved in this practice of selling pardons, and he also has fake relics that he will either sell or show for a fee. And that in Patterson's mind, that Chaucer is not really trying to produce a psychologically realistic sexual identity so much as he's trying to make a comment on the loss of efficacy of the church, that the church used to be a stallion, I guess, and now has been reduced to being kind of impotent. Now, that's not, the mare makes it more difficult, but gelding is pretty clear. So I do, so certainly I have thoughts about this, and I encourage you to look up articles and things, and we will, when we get to the partners, we'll either talk about it in the general prologue or we'll talk about it when we get to I can't remember if I have the partner's tale in the syllabus. Anyway, we will talk about it more, but it is certainly a hot topic. He and the wife of Bath are probably the most written about characters on the pilgrimage, and for good reason. They're really both tremendously interesting and damaged humans, so they're fun and engaging to talk about. And then finally, number five, the host doesn't have that much said about him, except he's a good host. Why bother having him? Well, when you read, he does show up in a lot of the links. There is, he's the one that tries to get the miller to be quiet when he's drunk, to no avail. There also is a fight that breaks out between actually the partner and the host, because the partner tells the host that he should give him money for pardons and that he is enveloped in sin. And the host says, I wish I had your testicles and I would enshrine them in a turd, which is not pleasant in any way. So he does show up, and we do get some personality from him. So he doesn't really, we don't see very much of him in terms of personality in the general prologue, but what you'll find is that he acts as kind of the MC who helps, tells who's up on deck and who's going next, and thanks everybody for their tales. So as you read through the tales, you'll get more of his personality than you do from the prologue, where you're right, there's not very much portrayed about him. Okay, so these are great. I will, I'll get this posted. I'll send questions for the actual general prologue itself that we'll do for next week, and we'll get prepared for that. But I'm glad that y'all are underway with this. We do need to start thinking about a midterm exam, and I'll be thinking about it. And obviously, it'll take the place of something that you'll write at home some kind of essay. And if you have some ideas for it, I certainly will accept them. But I'll be thinking about what, because we've got the dream visions, but we have started into the tales, so we'll at least cover, I think, the general prologue. But we're getting close to midterm, so we need to figure out what we're going to do about that. All right. Well, I hope that you all have a good week. You don't have to post anything else this week. I'll let you know. I'll try to get an intro video and a set of questions posted by Sunday or Monday, somewhere in there. But I hope that you all are well and have a happy Parliament of Fowls style Valentine's Day.